Hi everybody, I'm Vanessa Kim. I'm currently writing a book called Saving Reason from Obliteration. I'm a philosopher, I've got a Master's of Arts in Philosophy, and I share my content here with you for my research. So thank you so much for your likes, comments and subscriptions. It's really making the process enjoyable. Today I want to talk about fallibilism. So let's start off with Ayn Rand's epistemological absolutism. So Rand rejected fallibilism and relativism, both of which treat knowledge as tentative or socially constructed. Instead, she held that objectivity means that reality exists independently of consciousness, so existence exists, so reason is our only means of knowledge, A is A, and knowledge is contextual, but absolute within its proper context. For Ayn Rand, certainty does not mean omniscience. It means that one properly applies reason and integrates knowledge without contradiction. And in this way, one achieves certainty. For example, absolutism in this context is where Newton's laws of motion are absolute within their proper context, classical mechanics. They were not disproven by Einstein, but they were shown to be a special case in a broader framework. Another one, murder is always immoral. This is an absolute moral principle, not because it's a divine command, but because it contradicts the nature of human life and rational existence. Let's look at Rand versus intrinsicism. Rand did not believe in intrinsic absolutes, the idea that truth exists out there, detached from human cognition. For her, truth is absolute, but it must be grasped through reason. An example of an intrinsicist approach Rand rejected was Plato, who held that moral and mathematical truths exist in a separate realm of forms. Rand rejected this view of mysticism, and she believed that truth must be discovered, validated, and integrated by man's mind through reason. Let's look at Rand versus relativism. Relativism holds that truth depends on cultural, personal, or historical contexts, that your truth and my truth may be different. Rand rejected this entirely. She said a relativist might say science was just a European cultural project. Other civilizations have different truths. Rand would say truth is truth. The laws of physics, mathematics, and logic apply regardless of culture. Now let's look at Rand versus fallibilism. Fallibilists argue that all knowledge is open to revision. Rand disagreed. Knowledge expands, but does not become less true. For example, you might ask me, is the pharmacy open tomorrow? And I might say, yes, it is. It's always open on a Tuesday. It's been open every Tuesday since its inception 3 years ago. And then you might say, but it's a public holiday tomorrow, so it may not be open. And I'd say, no, it's been open on every public holiday. It will be open tomorrow. So I'm making a knowledge claim about the pharmacy being open. This is based on the pharmacy always being open every Tuesday. Now, what happens tomorrow is a fire goes through the pharmacy and the pharmacy is not open. Am I going to say that I can never rely on any knowledge claim that's made by anybody, even though it's based on research and it's based on what's always been the case and so on? It's important to understand that it's not that all knowledge is revisable. The knowledge claim that I've made is what's always been the case for that pharmacy. But now there's a new context, and this is what happens when a pharmacy has a fire go through it. This is a new context. And so it's not that the old information about that pharmacy was incorrect. It's just that there's now new information which now expands the information that we have about the pharmacy. So fallibilists argue that all knowledge is open to revision. Rand disagrees. He says knowledge expands and it does not become less true. So in terms of Rand's absolutism, truth is objective and it's independent of personal opinions. Knowledge, once properly validated, is certain within its context. Moral principles are absolute because they are derived from reality and man's nature. Absolutism is not dogmatic, it's contextual and rooted in reason. There's a host of physicists and philosophers that are realists or objective realists, but they still allow skepticism to come into their philosophies. Philosophy is a bit of a battleground. On one side stands the defenders of reality, those who say truth exists and knowledge is possible and that we can grasp it. And on the other are the agents of doubt who claim that knowledge is never final, the truth is always an approximation, and certainty is an illusion. When you look at reality, for example, you've engineered a plane to stay in the air, you better be certain that what you're talking about there is real and that the plane can stay up in the air. There better be some truth about that. And, you know, our whole world works like that. I mean, bridges that we walk across, we better be certain that those bridges hold. So the battle over fallibilism is that it's a doctrine that no knowledge is ever fully certain, that all human thought is subject to revision, and that even the most established truths are tentative. This idea is championed by Karlpopper. It's echoed by Robert Nozick, who I talked about last week, and I'll leave a link in the description to last week's video if you're interested in his work on invariances. I am going to do more work on Robert Nozick's invariances because they hold a very big part to objectivity. But as I said, this idea is championed by Karlpopper, by Robert Nozick. It's also accepted by physicist Alan Sokal, who's at New York University. Although they are all people that accept objective realism, but there are these issues with how far to go in terms of calling it knowledge, in terms of calling it an absolute fact. Also, there are other philosophers like Paul Boghossian, a Silver Chair professor at New York University, and Maria Baghramian, the editor of the Stanford Encyclopedia for the page on relativism. And they argue against relativism and they argue for objective knowledge. But even they stop short of fully embracing certainty. And then, as I've mentioned, Ayn Rand, who rejects fallibilism entirely and provides the only consistent absolute foundation of knowledge. So I'm going to look a bit at exposing fallibilism as an erosion of reason and demonstrating its dangers and showing why objectivism actually provides the rational approach to truth. So Karlpopper, the father of falsification, argued that science does not conform to truths, it only eliminates falsehoods. According to him, no theory is ever proven, it's only not yet disproven. And this is fallibilism in its purest form, the belief that knowledge is always temporary and open to correction, and it's never absolute. But what does this actually mean? It means that no principle, no scientific law, no discovery is ever final. That no matter how much evidence supports a conclusion, we must always assume that it might be wrong. This is not an epistemology of reason, it's an epistemology of doubt. A scientist does not stare at a formula and say, well, this equation holds today, but it probably won't be tomorrow. Popper reduces knowledge to a game of perpetual uncertainty, but objectivism holds that certainty is possible. Certainty does not mean infallibility. That's really important to note. It means that knowledge reached by a rational method within a proper context with no contradictions is certain. Fallibilism is self-defeating. If we can never be sure of anything, then we cannot even be sure of fallibilism itself. Robert Nozick takes a more subtle approach in philosophical explanations. He argues that knowledge depends on counterfactual conditions. If there is any possible scenario where you could be wrong, then you do not really have knowledge. This is the skeptic's wedge, an endless game of what if. What if I'm dreaming? What if I'm a brain in a vat? What if reality suddenly changes tomorrow? But knowledge is not a fragile thing, waiting to collapse under imagined possibilities. Objectivism rejects Nozick's sliding scale of truth. Either you know something or you don't. Knowledge is contextual but certain, meaning that within a given context, if no contradiction exists, knowledge is absolute. Nozick's epistemology is a compromise between realism and skepticism, and compromises with skepticism always leads to skepticism winning. Paul Boghossian is the realist who challenges relativism, and he totally rejects relativism actually. In his book Fear of Knowledge, he demolishes the claim that truth is just a social construct or that all perspectives are equally valid. And he argues that science, logic and reason are not mere cultural narratives, but real ways of knowing reality. And this is a powerful argument. And in this, objectivism agrees with Paul Boghossian. While he rejects relativism, he still flirts with fallibilism, acknowledging that knowledge might always be revisable. Yet, if all knowledge is revisable, then no knowledge is fully certain. Objectivism makes a stronger claim. Truth is not a temporary agreement, it's an identification of reality. So Boghossian's realism is valuable, but it stops short of absolute certainty, and without that, skepticism always has a foothold. Maria Baghramian, who's a defender of realism, is also still too cautious. There's another defender of realism against relativism, and she critiques the idea that all truth is socially constructed and argues for objective knowledge. However, she defends fallibilism as a necessary safeguard against dogmatism. This is a false alternative, as if the only choices are either radical skepticism or blind faith. Ayn Rand rejects both. Objectivism holds that certainty is possible, not as a dogmatic assertion, but as a rational conclusion. Certainty does not mean infallibility. It means a proper grasp of reality within a full context without contradictions. The physicist Alan Sokal is famous for his hoax against postmodern relativists, showing that radical skepticism is self-refuting nonsense. But even Sokal does not go far enough. Like Popper, he still leaves room for the idea that all knowledge is subject to revision. But if knowledge is always subject to revision, then certainty is impossible. This is where objectivism draws the line. Truth is objective, knowledge is absolute, and fallibilism is a subtle poison that weakens reason. And remember, when we're talking about knowledge being absolute, we're always talking about it in terms of context. So in conclusion, we've seen two sides in this battle. The fallibilists who tell us the truth is never certain, the realists who defend truth but leave the door open for skepticism. Objectivism goes further. It rejects fallibilism completely. Our mind is capable of certainty. Truth is not a shifting shadow. It's the grasp of reality by reason with absolute confidence within the context. So what are your thoughts? Feel free to leave your comments below. They don't have to agree with mine, and happy to look at your research as well. So take care, and I'll hopefully see you in a few days. Bye.